speaker, and I'm really thrilled to do that. I've had the pleasure to work with Kevin for many years now and really to learn from him. And I have a lot that I would love to share, but for brevity, let me just share his impressive professional credentials. Kevin is the Director of Assessment and Research at the Whitney Academy in East Freetown, Massachusetts. He has over 30 years of clinical experience with children, adolescents, and their families, working extensively with physically and sexually aggressive youth. Over the past 15 years, his primary focus has been on issues of trauma and attachment difficulties, especially with regards to the neurological impact of trauma on behavior problems. Mr. Creedon trains and consults nationally and internationally to school systems, youth services, and mental health agencies. And if you've not had the pleasure to hear him in person, I really encourage you to do that, because he really is one of the best speakers and presenters I think that I have ever heard in my career. I also want to take a moment to just talk a little bit about the newest book by both Rob Longo, David Prescott, and John Bergman. The title of the book is Current Perspectives and Applications in Neurobiology, Working with Young Persons Who Are Victims and Perpetrators. And David Burton, when he reviewed the book, said that I don't think that I have ever seen a clear explanation of exactly how neurobiology affects the youth I work with, and I believe this volume will change the practices we use to help them. And the case studies alone are worth more than the purchase price of this book. So I hope that you will consider buying the book, becoming a sponsor, and I hope you enjoy this webinar. So I'm going to turn this over to you, Kevin, now.
Thanks, Joan, and welcome to everyone, and thanks for joining us. In a very short period of time today, we're going to try to cover a lot of information and a lot of ground. So what we'll start with is a quick review of brain structure, just for folks who may not be particularly up to date on that, or who perhaps in the past haven't done a lot of look at neurobiology. Then we'll look at the research that we know about the impact of trauma on the brain, because that really is going to kind of inform what we do about our interventions. And then finally, we'll look, at least the way I begin to think about putting together interventions, or what interventions I'd like to be doing based on what the kids we're working with are presenting. When I've done trainings before at various conferences or just workshops, people tend to get really excited when we talk about the research around trauma in the brain, but one of the real difficulties is, and what I often find with folks, is that then when it comes to actually putting this into practice, people feel somewhat lost. And in general, we tend to go back to the treatment interventions and the treatment style and the treatment modalities that we're most comfortable with. And if you haven't been trained in more movement-based or sensory-based types of treatment interventions, which we'll talk about, the tendency is to get excited about the research but not actually put it into practice. So hopefully we can ease people's kind of fears and qualms a little bit today, and make this accessible to folks. So the first thing we want to do is just take a look at basic brain structure. So here's a picture of your brain. Yes?
You would just have to accept the show your screen. We don't see your slides.
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. You're doing great. We just need the visual. Thank you. That's perfect. Okay. I'm going to bow back out. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Anna. So let's take a look at basic brain structure, and this is going to be a fairly simplistic view of this. Things are perhaps a bit more complicated when for those of you who are neuropsychologists or are very much into neurobiology, but I want to give just a basic overview here. So on your screen, hopefully you're seeing that pink lower portion of the brain there, and that's referred to as the lower brain, or sometimes the reptilian brain. And in very simplistic terms, it's basically focused on sensory input and modulating your physiological state, so movement, balance, heart rate, hunger and thirst, fight and flight. Those sort of activities are really the focus of that lower brain or reptilian brain. The next major part of the brain, what you see there on the kind of yellow-greenish section of the slide. That would be the limbic system. And again, in sort of broad terms, the limbic system is responsible for processing emotions. Important to remember here, though, that every sensory input that you have coming in gets an emotional response. I think sometimes we have a tendency to split off the physiological and the emotional and the cognitive. Really what recent brain research has showed us is that these are integrated all the time. So your limbic system and your lower brain in constant conversation with one another in terms of processing just what's going on in your environment and what's going on for you internally on a regular basis. And then the last major area of the brain, the cortex, the blue piece that you see wrapping completely around there, is essentially responsible for sort of higher analytical processing. Oftentimes when we think of learning and thinking, we think of that we're really talking about that sort of cortex area of the brain. And then the final piece, which is not sort of clearly delineated there, but which sits right up in the front, would be the front left section as you're looking at the slide there. And right behind your eyebrows is the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is essentially responsible for executive functioning skills, and we'll talk a lot about that later. But when I talk to parents or our staff about the prefrontal cortex, I oftentimes say that the prefrontal cortex is responsible for all those things kids do that make you crazy, because your prefrontal cortex in general terms is responsible for regulating your physical state, regulating your emotional state, organizing your environment, focusing your attention, developing what we call cognitive flexibility, essentially not doing the same stupid thing over and over again, even when it's not working for you. Working memory. So all of those skills are essentially being controlled there in that prefrontal cortex. Now, normal brain development happens from bottom to top, right to left, and from back to front. That's important to keep in mind. So bottom to top, right to left, back to front, which means the last part of your brain to fully develop is that left prefrontal cortex. And in general, the last part of your brain to fully develop is the prefrontal cortex. And when you think about that, that's enormously important, because all of those skills, all of those things that we just talked about in terms of being executive functioning skills, it means they're not fully coming online, or they're not sort of responding as they could, or as quickly as they could, or as well integrated as they might, until we're mid to late 20s. So that if you're working with kids, and particularly if you're working with adolescents, even adolescents without trauma histories are still going to act like adolescents, because that prefrontal cortex, that sort of executive control center, is still under development. So if we look at that as the kind of basic overall structure of the brain, then we need to, in some ways, talk about what we mean by trauma. And oftentimes people have said, well, you know, not every difficult thing that happens to a child in their life is a traumatic incident. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. The experience of trauma is really very individual. The things that we typically think of or would be noted in a child's history in terms of being traumatic, we assume are things like and witnessing violence and you know, neglect. Those would be the things that typically come up as traumatic incidents. But how a child experiences any incident is actually very individually experienced in terms of, you know, their own state, their developmental stage, the resources that they have available to them, the temperament that the child is kind of wired for. So all of those things are going to impact the sort of symptoms and the response to any particular incident. But what we do know is that, and this really comes from a number of studies, but probably the broadest study that's being done now is what's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And it's a longitudinal study being done by folks at the CDC. And really what they've come to show is that it's not about even single traumatic incidences in terms of its impact on children, but it's really the sort of mounting up or the accumulative effect of those adverse experiences over time. And some of those things are the ones we've talked about, sexual abuse and physical abuse, but other adverse experiences can be living in poverty, going through the divorce of your parents, having a significant medical problem early on in your childhood or during your childhood that keeps you out of your peer interaction. So a number of things that oftentimes we don't put in the trauma category can still, when they begin to sort of stack up on one another, end up having the same neurodevelopmental and developmental impacts that what we typically think of, or what oftentimes are called the big T traumas in your life, that they will have. So it's important to recognize, and especially when you're doing work with kids, to go through the history enough to know where all those difficulties might arise, particularly in terms of kids' development, because those are oftentimes going to point you to the places where there's obstacles and gaps in skills and where we need to focus our interventions on. One of the key elements of recognizing the impact of cumulative harm is understanding that developmental skills proceed from the simple to the complex. And so that early developmental tasks provide those critical skills and traits that are the foundation for the later, more complicated skills that we have to show. And so that understanding where there might be missing skills in those foundation skills really directs us to where the interventions are going to be. One of the interesting bits of information that we can see here are the kinds of developmental insults or difficulties that lead to sort of post-traumatic behavioral problems. And it's important to look at this because what we see here are things like emotional abuse and the loss of important emotional relationships in your life and impaired caregivers really are at the top of the list, and we might not necessarily always think of those at the top of the list. I would identify those first three things that you're seeing there on the screen: emotional abuse, loss of important relationships, and impaired caregivers, as being insults in terms of your attachment relationships. And then the other things that we oftentimes put into the sort of big T traumas, domestic violence, sexual abuse, neglect, and physical abuse, are sort of outgrowths in some ways of the impairments that you see there at the top of the list. So this is just to give you a little sense, and this is information that comes from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, but gives you some sense of the type of cumulative harm, that sort of processes that go on, so that having an impaired caregiver or not having consistent important relationships in your life oftentimes actually place you at risk for being in situations where there's domestic violence, sexual abuse, neglect, and physical abuse. If now we look at the research that really started about 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, and it comes from people like Marty Teicher and Michael DeBellis, and a whole range of folks now have begun to look at this. And what they looked at was how trauma really impacted not only functional development in your brain, but actual structural development in your brain. And this research goes on a consistent basis. There's really new research, almost every month as new journals are published. But I wanted to highlight these four areas because these seem to be the pieces that have most consistently come through as each bit of research has developed. And so we're pretty confident that these are aspects of neurodevelopment that are specifically impacted by those early trauma experiences of children. And the ones that we have here: increased limbic irritability, decreased left hemisphere development, decreased left-right hemisphere integration, and limited activation of the cerebellar vermis and self-regulation. Now, one of the reasons actually for doing this webinar is if I gave you that list of 4 things and then said, okay, that's what the research tells you, go out and develop interventions for those. The intervention that you might do for any one of those is not immediately obvious. So let's begin to kind of unpack these 4 aspects a little bit and see where they might lead us in terms of thinking about interventions. The first part I want to do, though, is begin to unpack them in terms of the area of the brain being affected. So we looked at that increased limbic irritability, okay? When we're looking at that, we're really looking at focusing on a part of your brain that you see here listed as the amygdala, okay? And the amygdala is that little P-shaped thing at the front part of your brain that sits inside your limbic system. And as it says here, it's responsible for anxiety, fear, and emotions. When Teicher was looking at sort of PET scans and functional MRIs and comparing youth with experiences of abuse and neglect against youth who had no experiences of abuse and neglect, what he saw was this huge level of electrical activity coming out of the amygdala. And at first, there was actual thought that what he might be looking at were things like temporal lobe epilepsy. But really what we're looking at is this increased arousal state. And I think it's important to note here that your brain is built to give priority to 2 bits of information in the environment above all others. There's 2 bits of information that sort of get fast-tracked in terms of processing in your brain. And the 2 that are at the top of the list are the processing of threat cues and the processing of sexual cues. And that's very evolutionary in nature. The reason why threat cues get kind of top billing is because if you're not paying attention to threat cues, you die. And the reason why sex cues get top billing is because if you're not paying attention to sex cues, then you don't procreate and then you die. So that this becomes a significant, factor in terms of understanding what's going on for these kids, because we see this huge level of limbic irritability and therefore a huge push in terms of the amygdala in terms of responding to that. Next, you have your hippocampus, which is crucial to memory, learning facts. One of the things we have found is that with that increase in the amygdala response, one of the responses that can happen in your brain is that the hippocampus actually begins to atrophy. Since it's crucial to memory and learning facts, it's not surprising that many of our kids oftentimes have difficulties in school. We're going to talk about the cortex development. That left hemisphere development is up in your cortex. And then the cerebellum, which is the seat of motor control, also has a huge number of stress receptors in it. And that is going to lead us into lowering that limbic response through things like movement, balance, and more sensory integrated responses.
Kevin, I just want to you had asked me to remind you when you're about halfway through, so we could extend your time, but I want to let you know, give you just a quick time check there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So that one of the things we're trying to do here is, again, use this research. This is actually some data that comes from Bruce Perry. And one of the things he did is look at about 580 kids that came into his trauma clinic. And one of the things he was noticing and measuring is their base heart rates. And so what you see here is data that comes from Perry's group, and what you see on one axis is the beats per minute in terms of the kids who came into his clinic, and the next thing you see is the ages down at the bottom. One of the things you notice, particularly about the males in his study, are they are persistently above the normal expected pediatric heart rate, which is that sort of dotted line with the yellow triangles there. That normal expected pediatric heart rate and that change, we oftentimes talk about these kids as being impulsive or going from 0 to 60 in a snap. One of the things this is telling us is that these kids aren't going from 0 to 60 because they're not starting their day at 0. And from an intervention point of view, what this begins to suggest to us is that lowering that heart rate, bringing those kids back down to a place where they can be easily regulated, actually is enormously important if we want to give them the time before they get overwhelmed to make better decisions, make different decisions than they're currently making. The other thing you notice here, and it shows up as the females on those sort of squares at the bottom, you notice that the other response to being having that persistent experience of stress is not only this externalizing behavior, which you see in the males, but also dissociative behavior, which is really what's showing up there in the females. And this is not, Perry wouldn't argue that only males externalize or females dissociate, but he would suggest that your body has two specific experiences or specific responses to experiencing stress, and that is that externalization response or dissociating. And both of those are in the service of trying to help you control and modulate those external responses. So if we look at the types of needs that get brought up by these difficulties, when we're looking at limbic irritability, we're talking about the strong need for safety and structure. We're talking about the importance of learning self-regulation practices. And we need to know that the attention of our kids may be diminished because they're going to constantly be screening for threat cues. Because remember, again, threat gets top filling in your brain in terms of what you're paying attention to. In terms of that deficient left hemisphere development, we're going to find that kids have a hard time learning from emotionally charged experiences, and they often have intense emotions without being able to label them. And that deficient left-right hemisphere integration means that kids are going to have difficulty in terms of their ability to effectively integrate information and analyze information. And then finally, the abnormal activity in the cerebellar vermis is going to suggest to us that movement-based or kinesthetically based interventions are going to be useful when we begin to think about self-regulation. Really important in terms of understanding this process, and I'll actually go back a second to the left hemisphere development. Important to recognize that in your left hemisphere is where language processing tends to happen. And the reason, as we begin to talk about interventions, that we're not going to sort of totally rely on language-based interventions is because what the research is telling us is that language skills may be one of the biggest areas impacted in terms of our kids' trauma experiences. And one of the real difficulties we've had in the past is that as clinicians trained in talking therapies, we oftentimes focus on speech and language-based interventions as our primary treatment modalities, when in fact many of the folks we work with, including their families, may be much better visual learners and kinesthetically based learners than they are verbal learners. So let's go back here in terms of, and then the final part we need to look at, and it really talks about those cumulative trauma pieces that we put in the beginning, is that as we found out more about how trauma impacts brain functioning, a lot of the research has pointed us to the fact that kids with poor early attachment relationships literally have less integration and fewer neural connections between that prefrontal cortex and their limbic system. And therefore the response, the impact of that means that their capacity for emotional regulation, their ability to respond to social cues, and their capacity to evaluate meaning in terms of social meaning gets greatly limited. And therefore, the two major areas we want to talk about are really sort of looking at how we focus on attachment issues and how we focus on self-regulation issues. From that prefrontal cortex point of view, self-control and self-regulation are really built up from these skills. I put this out there not because we really have time to go into the entire aspects of executive functioning, but more because I wanted people to see all those different skills that are actually engaged in the executive functioning process. And so these all then, if those four things at the bottom of your screen, the perception, emotion, cognition, and action, as you look at those skills, those all become targets for potential interventions. Therefore, if we're looking to increase your capacity to self-regulate from that prefrontal cortex point of view, the two pieces that we really want to initiate at first are increasing the awareness of your internal cues. So for example, the interventions would look at things like body mapping and biofeedback types of interventions. So we want to make you aware of and be able to name those internal cues at first. And then we want to teach specific skills in terms of targeting things like your attention through yoga, tai chi. Brainwise is a sort of cognitive curriculum that can be used for helping kids make better behavioral decisions. Lumosity is software that can be used for sort of targeting attention and problem-solving skills. So there's a wide range of ways to begin to tap into those executive skills area. And then if we look for interventions for executive functioning difficulties that are externally driven, you can see the list of things here, and we'll actually talk about those more as we go along. Two things to keep in mind: the way you change the kind of damage, the neurological damage that is done to kids, is either through the direct stimulation of a specific brain area or skill area, or you're looking for changes in the environmental experiences that the child has. If you're doing direct interventions, you're looking at specific skill training like biofeedback, like neurofeedback. Certainly psychopharmacology is one type of doing a direct intervention on a particular brain area, looking at doing attunement exercises. But the important aspect of doing direct interventions is this: neurons develop by persistent stimulation of those neurons. So not only do you need to teach the skill, but you need to have systemically and both in your practice the specific and repeated training of those skills if it's really going to make an impact. And then the environmental impacts are really things around structure, stability, essentially stimulating them, giving them folks enough experience in order to begin to make a difference in terms of their lives. Patricia Critton really talked about, and this really directs a lot of our interventions, that the way to transform behavior is to start kind of from the bottom up, because that's how it starts developmentally. So that we're looking for sensory stimulation, the experience of something. It is the repeated experience of things that really leads to those experiences then getting transformed into information, something about the way we know our lives. And then that information becomes a dispositional representation, or what oftentimes gets referred to in attachment as an internal working model. And it is really from that that we begin to actually change the enacted behavior. So again, this is just a way of talking about the need to think about interventions from a developmental point of view as you begin to build an intervention program. I would argue that the three things we're trying to work on, or the three ways we've divided these up, is through looking at things that provide structure, things that provide for self-regulation, and ways to develop attachments with kids. By and large, for the kids that we see, we sort of primarily work with bottom-up interventions first, and then eventually move to top-down interventions, again, because that's typically the way development happens. So when you begin to think about what should I do first, what I would say is be guided by developmental processes. Consider bottom-up before top-down. Consider environmental and then specific, and then remember that you're going to have to persistently do these things. Developmental just simply means targeting those things that are early in normal development. And basically, so you're looking at how do you provide safety, how do you work on attunement, basically mirroring and attachment skills, then self-regulation, then motor skills, social skills, cognitive skills, and moral development. So you're really starting from bottom to top here. And then a sort of wonderful resource guide for folks is something that the Australian government put out in terms of a Child Development and Trauma Guide. You can get that online from SACASA for those of you who have forgotten kind of what actual normal development looks like at different stages of kids. It can really be a wonderful way to begin to think about where you target your interventions at. And this just gives you, again, a kind of simple way of thinking about starting with the sensory, moving towards the motor, and then doing the kind of higher cognition interventions, and those are the ones we tend to do typically, I would ask people to begin to back up their process a little bit in terms of that. So if we're looking at doing bottom-up or sensory-based interventions, what we're talking about is really kind of understanding and using all the senses. So as it says here, sight, sound, taste, smell, and touch, those become the places that we want to make interventions at. So what's the lighting in the room? What are the sounds or the smells that you want to bring in, such as music or lavender or other things that might, just through the environment, without having to sort of consciously focus on them, begin to change the way that the lower brain is responding to the sensory input in the environment. And again, allowing people to use those to kind of set the foundation and set the stage for learning further skills. Then again, we're moving from the sensory to the body base, so looking at interventions that provide deep pressure in terms of massage or weighted blankets or other use of touch. Movement-based. Again, what happens with your infant when they get sort of nudgy or overwhelmed? We use things like walking and rocking types of interventions with them to calm them down and soothe them. And then particularly for kids with more aggressive behaviors or kids with more impulsive behaviors, it's important to look at sort of activating the large muscle groups. So doing things like regular exercise, again, sort of movement-based things like yoga and Tai Chi, but also sort of progressive muscle relaxation and other ways that engage the proprioceptive pieces. Again, and remember we talked about in the beginning, brain development happens from bottom to top, from right to left, and from back to front. So if we're working developmentally at the next stage of interventions, we need to understand what activates the right hemisphere. So the use of rhyme and rhythm and music and conveying information, keeping your language as simple as possible, and then when you're using language, making sure that, and engaging the kids and putting, say, the take-home messages from group that day or the important things I want you to remember into a rhyme, into a rap, into some sort of rhythm so that it's easily remembered. The engagement of use of movement and art and music to begin to identify and convey emotion. So oftentimes with kids, as opposed to telling me how you feel, I want them to do a movement or identify a sound that kind of really brings out for them what they're feeling at a particular time before we start labeling that emotion with a particular word. And then a way to begin to integrate the sort of cortex information with that lower brain information is through the use of role play and psychodrama for education or challenging and examining cognitive assumptions. And those sort of pieces begin to happen later on in the treatment once you've gotten kids to the point where they can actually kind of focus and regulate their immediate responses to the cues in the environment. And then finally, the top-down approaches are, again, the more typical things we do in therapy: examining cognitive assumptions, setting realistic goals, actually beginning to process the traumatic event. But I would argue that instead of rushing to process the traumatic events first, what we're really doing is providing that containment and safety for kids by working on the structure, the self-regulation, the attachment first, before we get to the stage of trauma treatment that allows for the actual breaking down, understanding of the traumatic events, and developing a new narrative in terms of how we experience them ourselves. So that is a real quick overview in terms of how I begin to think about doing treatment and thinking about interventions for kids. Again, if you want to understand a basic notion of where I work from, I would say this becomes your overall model. Think about how you put in place structure. Think about how you begin to regularly help kids modulate and regulate their emotional responses, both internal and external, and also their physiological responses. And then how do you begin to focus on the basic skills needed for attachment relationships, and that starts with attunement. So at that point, Joan?
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. That's fabulous. I'm blown away by how you've been able to capture just so much in so little time. So thank you. I really appreciate that. And what I wanted to do is just again open this up right now to everybody's questions. I know that a couple questions have already come through, and but I guess I'm wondering, Kevin, just as you've gone through here, just maybe just to get us started, and I think there's great questions coming through, so I will ask some of those as well. But just, I think you've talked a lot about interventions from what can individual treatment providers do in terms of engaging kids and families, and I'm wondering if you can maybe just talk a little bit about how do you begin to also convince the environments that the kids might be in, the schools, the clinics or residential programs, to also to take on sort of the model that you're explaining here. That would be fabulous.
Yeah, Joan, and I think that's that again is sometimes the hardest thing that people have to do, both with kids and families, and also in the consultation work I've done with schools, or even here at Whitney when we're trying to get staff buy-in to this treatment approach. I've always found that the first thing really starts with education, so that every kid who comes into our program and every family that I work with and all the staff as they go through orientation, the first thing we do is teach them about their brains. I mean, basically with the kids, it becomes sort of here's your brain and here's your brain on trauma, and these are the things we're trying to impact. And then using things like very simple biofeedback, just learning how to take your heart rate, or playing a biofeedback video game so you can see your how your heart is beating and how you're reacting. Helping kids make the connection between goes on with your body, this generates a physiological response, and this generates a feeling, and helping them make that connection means that we get more buy-in when we actually give them, say, let's do a yoga exercise, or let's do some sort of deep breathing exercise, or let's rock back and forth, as opposed to kids just going, this is dumb and boring and stupid. They actually understand why we're asking them to do that. And then we might take your pulse before you do the exercise and take your pulse afterwards, and then you can see that it's actually made a difference in how your body's responding. And I find in some ways I do the same things with teachers in schools, or larger systems. We try to give them education first, and then make the connection between the exercises that we're doing and what we're going to see physiologically or behaviorally in kids as they begin to respond to those interventions.
Great, thank you. I think that someone had asked, which I think you sort of addressed as well here, is that when if the students continue to work in the same environment outside of treatment, what would be the impact of that? And I think you've addressed that pretty well by saying that if it's integrated, that obviously will have a big, more importantly, it just have a better impact on the kid that you're working with.
Yeah, I think it is really important there, because we know that the only way to really sort of change or rewire or make up functionally for some of the neurological damage that gets done to kids by trauma in their early childhood is through the persistent stimulation of neural pathways. And that means that doing it for an hour a week just in your office is probably not going to be sufficient to make the kind of changes that we want to make. And so it really is important in doing this work to begin working systemically, to talk to the school where the kid is at, so that they're doing some of the same things or addressing some of the same issues that you're addressing. And you sell that to them by the fact that we know if the kid can self-regulate better, if they feel safer in their environment, if they feel connected to their school, they in fact learn better. So it's not just, oh, do this because it makes my therapy easier. You actually are sort of suggesting that they do this is because the child will learn better, there'll be less of a behavior problem in school. So you really want to paint for them what the benefits are for them. And the same is true for families. You want kids to be doing this stuff at home, and ideally you want them to be doing it with their families, with their parents. But if you're expecting them to do that, then you need to have the families and the parents be part of the therapy, and you need to be regularly practicing these in your office so that the family gets used to it and they see the benefit of it.
That's great. Thank you. Kevin, some people we're getting some great questions here, and I just want to say I'm not sure we'll be able to get to all of them, but so I'll just try to pick a few. But one person asked if you can give maybe an example of an attunement exercise that could be used in a group as a first step to introduce sort of a brain-based focus.
Sure. Actually, one of the easiest ones that we do in group, it could be something like drumming. Drumming's an attunement exercise. So if I were in a group, if I have drums, that's fine. We actually, I have a sort of little set of portable drums that I oftentimes bring to group with me, but you can use a table, and you can do something like just start a beat, a simple beat, that then has to pass from, let's say, the therapist to the next person around the table, and then the next, and it comes all the way back around, and then I'll change it when it gets back to me, and then it goes around the table again. And again, the idea here is that people have to both focus on what's going on with someone else and also mirror that sensory input that's coming in. Three-legged races is a great attunement exercise. Jumping rope is a great attunement exercise. Any sort of mirroring, just having one person be the leader, one person be the follower, and have the task be keep eye contact and mimic what the person in front of you is doing. And if you think about it, and again, think developmentally about this, a lot of the interactions that you see parents, or if you're a parent yourself, that you have with your infants is about that process of mirroring and mimicking that goes on, so that people are at the same emotional state and engaging in similar types of physical activity and facial expressions, all those things that go on. And if you want to go back to perhaps, one attunement exercise that probably everyone did at some portion of their life. Patty cake is an attunement exercise. If you watch mothers and infants play patty cake together. So I always think about when we do the drumming exercise, that's essentially what we're replicating, is that we're replicating what patty cake would look like for a group of 6 adolescent boys.
Great. And a couple of people have been asking questions alongside the age, and like, for example, one question is, how young do you think this kind of work can be done with children, and how old can kids be for this to really be beneficial? And someone else asked about pre-verbal trauma and how this impacts that. So I think that just if you can maybe speak a little bit to the younger end of the spectrum of how this can be used, how effectively, what age groups?
I mean, I've really used it myself with kids as young as 3, and through adults. I mean, I don't think this is limited age-wise. I mean, one of the things, and we go back to that notion we talked about in terms of cumulative harm in the beginning, if you're working with adults who are still missing those basic skills of attunement, of self-regulation, then you need to go back and do interventions based on those foundation skills, and incorporating movement and visuals and music into the treatment, I've actually found to be very positive for all ages, and with very young kids. And I would suggest that even with kids under the age of 3, doing movement exercises where there's touch involved and pressure involved to help them learn how to regulate, putting those kids on top of those big exercise balls and letting them rock back and forth, with very young children, engaging their parents with them in how they use touch, being held, being read to. One of the great kind of attachment exercises, and I actually do it with up through adolescence, is having parents come in with their kids, literally sit next to each other on the couch, or if you have a very young child, they might sit in the parent's lap and just reading simple books to them. I mean, I've got 16-year-olds sometimes reading Goodnight Moon to really, for 5 minutes of the therapy session, because you're going back and really reconnecting with folks. Really dysfunctional families tend to either be totally enveloped with one another, so there's no sense of difference between everybody, or they're very disengaged. And so you want opportunities in the session where people are physically engaged with each other in positive, adaptive, developmental ways. So you go back and replay those experiences and stimulate those pathways from a neurological point of view.
Right. One person asked about why does emotional abuse seem to have a greater impact than other forms of abuse? What have you had any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I would suggest, and as I said when that slide came up, I would look at the top 3 or 4 that were in that slide group and look at those as real insults to attachment. We talked about the fact that human beings are biologically wired to avoid threat, and that amygdala response was built on that avoidance of threat. The other thing human beings are biologically wired to do is form attachment relationships. And you're not forming attachment relationships primarily to have a warm, fuzzy relationship with your mom, although that's really nice. But the reason why human beings are biologically wired to form attachments is because if they don't, they die. If you're an infant and you can't find a way to engage an adult to take care of your needs, you don't survive. So that the primary goal of attachment is safety. And then the secondary goal of attachment is what we typically think of as kind of attachment behaviors, which are more the affiliation or social aspects of it. But the real primary purpose of attachment is to develop an environment of safety. And I think that that emotional abuse, that disconnection, essentially that inability of the parent to be attuned to their child, really gives the message to infants. And Ed Tronick has done sort of wonderful research in this, but it really gives the message to the infant that something's wrong here, that they're not safe, and that stress really begins to impact their entire capacity to both take in information and to regulate their own physiological state. And so that's why I think it's kind of right there at the top.
All right. That's great. And a couple of people have asked about sort of resources, and so one specifically said, where might the Perry research be accessed? And also, what are some other just written materials that you would recommend if people wanted to delve in deeper into this issue?
Yeah, I would. The Perry material. He has a wonderful website. If you go to if you Google up Child Trauma Academy, it will actually give you access to a lot of Bruce Perry's research, both his earlier stuff and some of his more recent treatment-based stuff. Again, I think the SACASA website that we put up there earlier is a great resource. If you want just a kind of basic information in terms of what normal development looks like and the impact of trauma on that, there's a wonderful book by Steen and Kendall, and it's got some catchy title like the childhood neurodevelopment and its difficulties or something like that. But if you Google Steen and Kendall, you'll get that. And of course, I would actually say that the book we just edited actually and hopefully is a wonderful resource for folks because it looks at a number of ways of doing this. The chapters in the book go everywhere from Pat Ogden talking about body-based types of intervention, the GMAP program over in England, looking at their use of different self-regulation tools and how they've integrated into their program. Jerry Yeager has a great chapter about looking at the milieu of residential settings and how they can be informed by, neuro research. Rob Longo has chapters in terms of how you do direct stimulation through things like neurofeedback. So there's a whole range. We have a great chapter by Marcia Reardon that talks about sensory-based OT interventions and how to use those in terms of dealing with trauma. So it really offers that book offers a wide range of information in terms of all kinds of different ways that you can begin to approach it.
Great.
Forgive me for the little plug there.
I was actually going to say thank you for the plug. So, so I think that's great. And we'll also just some of these things just let people know that because we do have a newsletter that we will be putting out. So we'll try to have some of these resources that Kevin mentioned listed in the newsletter as well, and so you'll be able to find those if you're not as Google savvy as other people. I think we have again a lot of great questions. I'm having a hard time even picking through them, but here's one just like what are some of the specific recommendations that you would make to residential programs about what their milieu would look like and feel like, etc. So, and I think you could translate to not just residential programs, but almost any place where the ideal kinds of environments where kids could live and play.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that really come to mind. Oftentimes, when kids are in residential settings and they're struggling, the residential setting, and this is one of the best things about residential settings, is they have a consistent structure and they have a consistent schedule. The flip side of that is we can sometimes get more rigid than we need to be in terms of following the schedule. And then when kids struggle at different times, and speaking to folks from residential, and certainly we know here that some of those most difficult times are during the transition. So as kids go from the sort of residential area to the school area, from high-level activities like a recess or a lunch activity back to classroom time, from the change between the first shift and the second shift, from the time directly after dinner to evening activities, and then again at the end of the night from evening activities to sort of calming down and getting ready for bed. All of those tend to be really difficult times. So one of the suggestions I would have is for the residential programs to specifically structure into those times, and I would really say put it in your schedule, because one of the things we've discovered here is that when we first started this and we suggested different activities to residential folks or educational folks, it wasn't that people were resistant to them, but after doing them for a little while, they quickly got crowded out by other tasks that need to be done in the residential setting. I would really suggest structuring them in, making 5 minutes where kids could do a breathing exercise or a movement exercise or a yoga exercise, brain gym, whatever, to schedule those into your days so that kids can get regrounded and refocused and regulated as they move through those transitions, either at the beginning of those transitions or at the end of those transitions, and understand that when kids regularly have difficulties at different parts of the day or with different activities, as opposed to centering that and thinking about that as the kid's problem, sometimes we have to think about that as the environment's problem, and we have to make adjustments either in the level of the task or the speed in which it has to be done. We have to make those adjustments to make the environment a little bit more user-friendly and not so either overstimulating or understimulating or overwhelming for the kid if we find that he's regularly struggling with that.
Great, and I think we maybe have time for one last question. So I think we focused mostly on kids. We did have one or two questions here where people are talking, are there any good resources that how to incorporate this into a standard trauma screening, particularly that may be even used like for adults who may have experienced traumatic childhood experiences?
There's a number of different trauma screenings out there. So there are things like the trauma symptom checklist for children or the trauma symptom inventory that really begin to touch on some of these. In terms of doing evaluations, the things that certainly we've incorporated into our assessment here based on the research is we really focus on paying attention to any assessments that look at verbal skills and language-based skills. So we look at receptive expressive language disorders. Because of that lack of left hemisphere development, language skills are oftentimes limited in these kids, and we know that at least 30% of these kids have specific learning difficulties. So we spend a lot of time looking at language-based difficulties because it means we're going to make sure we're doing our treatment in non-language loaded ways, much more movement, visual, kinesthetic types of things. I think you want to always have in your assessment just a brief sensory assessment, and there's, again, I wouldn't recommend necessarily one tool over another. If you can make a connection with an OT, and particularly an OT who works with trauma, that is great because they'll tell you about tools that you can use. But knowing whether a kid is sensory avoidant or sensory active is important, whether they're seeking out greater stimulus or they're trying to move away from stimulus. All of that's I would incorporate into trauma assessments. And the last piece is I would incorporate some assessment for executive functioning into trauma assessments. So either something like the brief, which is a test you can use, which is really a rating scale done by parents and or by the individuals themselves, or specific tests like the Wisconsin card sorter, the Tower of London, or the Conners continuous performance task, but something that's going to look at executive functioning skills, at least just on a screening level. And then if those skills are lacking, you might then think about maybe this is a kid who needs a much kind of fuller neuropsychological assessment.
Great, thank you, Kevin. And just again to remind people that we will be taking some of these resources and that have been mentioned, and we'll put that in our next newsletter. And just to let you know that because you've signed up for the webinar, we'll automatically sign you up for this resource as well, and we hope that you'll find it useful. And it's a way of helping to continue the conversation, the dialogue today. I also want to just let people know that our next NeuriPress webinar is with Rob Longo, who also is one of the editors of this book that Kevin was talking about, and this will be about head injury, TBI, and its impact on the brain. Again, trying to make sure this is not staying in the research as much as how does the research affect clinical practice. I also just want to remind people that, again, that we are able to do this because of our sponsors. I want to do a thank you to our sponsors. This is and if you're interested in being a sponsor, please contact us directly at through the NeuriPress website or at info@neuripress.org. And as a thank you for anybody who is a sponsor, either individually or as an organization, we'll send a copy of current applications and current perspective series. For individuals, it's $98, and for organizations, it's $250. And in addition to being listed here, you're guaranteed a slot on all of the remaining NeuriPress webinars for this year. And finally, I want to just say thank you. Thank you first and foremost to Kevin. Again, I always learn a lot when I listen to you, so I really appreciate you taking the time to do this sort of online book signing with us. And most importantly, I just want to say that thank you to everybody here who participated in the web conference. We really appreciate your feedback. There will be an evaluation form that's sent to you when you sign off today. So we'll definitely look forward to any feedback, and we'll be using that to help enhance our series going forward. So I think we're now at the top of the hour. So I want to just say thank you again to everybody. Thank you, Anna, for being our tech. To Kevin, you've been fabulous as always, and to all of you who participated today. Thanks very much.
Joe.